All right. Hello, you bunch of Bernards. We're back here in the Scholar and Gentleman Live for another round of Dostoevsky discussion in memoriam of Chris Herron. Today we're reading Book 12, A Judicial Error, Part 1, basically through the prosecutor's speech grand finale. We'll pick up the defense attorney next week. I wrote in the description of this video that this is basically some sort of Maury Povich meets People's Court, featuring our favorite daytime drama family, the Karamazovs. And it is betrayal and drama and revelations and hysterics and madness and everything you'd expect in Dostoevsky. So I'll admit this is not my favorite section of the book. I do think there's a lot of interesting character development happens in the courtroom, but once we get to the attorney's speeches, I get a little bit like eyes glazed over sort of feeling, especially our dear prosecutor Ippolit Kirillovich, who Melissa accurately described just before this video started as a windbag.
You're just another one of those doubters who's been underestimating him his whole life.
He's unappreciated in his
You don't
time.
understand his genius.
Yes, the psychological insights into the criminal mind. I can't wait to talk about the mad troika. All right, well, let's go ahead and launch in. The Fatal Day, Chapter 1, basically just setting the scene. And once again, we have a sort of oddly noisy narrator here who goes out of his way to say, it's really hard to tell the whole story here. And a bunch of, and eventually like catches himself at how useless this is and shuts up. But I was sort of chuckling myself when he says something about, you know, which very much mirrors the end of the Gospel of John, where he says, I keep thinking if one were to recall everything, explain everything as one ought, it would fill a whole book, even a quite large one. Thankfully, we don't have to read that book. So I want to open the door to comments on this first chapter. There may not be a whole lot to say, considering it's kind of just one long scene setting. But I have an observation or two, but I'll open the gates first.
I mentioned the narrator, and I took note that the narrator's like taking a stand a couple times here, like even he has an opinion on the prosecutor, which is an interesting choice to me. Narrator sometimes is long-winded, but usually stays out of the way, other than to say Elios is a hero. So I found that interesting. It made me laugh a few times. It said someone had a hemorrhoidal face. And I enjoyed something about the men hating Mitya and the women liking him and rooting for him. I like that aspect of any trial where people are taking sides, and you've got an OJ thing going here. All the tickets are snapped up and
And let's not forget the defense lawyer's bird-like physiognomy. Sharply bird-like physiognomy.
I definitely made the comparison to the OJ thing as well, because I do think the narrator first introduces this idea that comes up multiple times, that this trial isn't just about Dmitri, it's about the national character and changing nationality. And I'm not gonna lie, I was really obsessed with all the movies coming out about the OJ case last year, that I think we're making the same argument. Like, that's where, to me, it wasn't just a a silly comparison? Was it really was like, this is the trial, or Dostoevsky is pitching it as the trial that is about all these changes that are taking place in Russian society, the liberalization of the courts, the integration of European ideas, where Russia stands on the world stage. And because of that, there's also a good bit of interest, but that also feels like the sort of elevated part going along with the sort of tawdry, like everyone just really likes to see people brought down element that was also part of the OJ case. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's pretty interesting, amusing, whatever you want to say, that right from the beginning, we're basically given the idea that the courtroom is pretty much divided down the gender line. All the men come in very serious and irritated and want to see him taken down, and all the women are in favor of his acquittal, even though they all believe he's guilty. And what I really liked about that was the statement on 657. Many ladies quarreled hotly with their husbands, owing to a difference of opinion about this whole terrible affair. And naturally, after that, all the husbands of these ladies arrived in court feeling not only ill-disposed towards the defendant, but even resentful of him.
Yeah, the people wanting him to be acquitted, even though they thought he was guilty, like that also reminded me of the OJ case. Ouch. Sorry, I had a cat claw.
Although getting at that chocolate.
In this case, it has something to do with the whole modern sentiments that are moving across Russia, and that this is going to be some great progressive victory to. I don't fully grasp what that idea is, but I guess it was the idea of maybe Rakitin's idea that he's sort of a product of the Russian environment or whatever, and as well as this idea that's being used of the insanity defense, but I was never quite clear. It was just going to be a great victory for enlightenment to set him free, and that's kind of hard to understand completely if you're fully convinced of his guilt.
Well, I don't want to overdo the OJ comparisons for people who weren't obsessed with the case, but I do think, like, rewatching all those documentaries, one of the things that came through is so many people wanted to see OJ acquitted, even if they thought he was guilty, because they were saying white men have been found innocent of crimes they've committed for decades. For a black man to do it would show that there has been some progress in the criminal justice system, right? Like, I feel like that's part of what's going on, and that's where I don't fully understand what's going on with the Russian courts and would need to spend more time. But it seems like the sort of sense of, okay, we're finally free of whatever weird thing was going on in the courts. Like, even if this was a miscarriage of justice, right, it would show, like, maybe it's something to do with too many people were punished too severely for too long, and there would be some sort of change. Like, it would be better for a guilty man to go free than, like, that's sort of what I was sensing, this movement towards that kind of a change.
That's an interesting point maybe to consider, if you're looking in the past at a sort of more autocratic system that just punishes everybody with or without adequate evidence. I don't know if y'all read the footnotes, but one of the footnotes in these chapters did indicate that the big reform that they are talking about is the start of trial by jury. So
I think it's maybe it has to do with like the overabundance of evidence, but like the evidence like being like this long story, kind of like what you said about like Rakitin, but like it's kind of like set up like this is like a psychological weird thing. This isn't like open and shut, like, oh, really evil guy like kills really good guy. It's like evil guy kills evil guy, but he has potential for good maybe, but it's like so like evidence is completely against him, but it's trial by jury, so like maybe they can convince him that you know, like this psychological stuff kind of goes in, and then he can get a lighter sentence or get off entirely. So that's kind of my thought on it. But
yeah, and you know, I mean, to skip ahead, there's even a moment where it seems like this might work. When things seem to be heading his direction, and the narrator even says, he probably would have gotten at least a lighter sentence, you know. Although that annoying narrator giving spoilers, geez.
But I mean, I do find this whole chapter with the narrator interesting and him giving spoilers. And I just wanted to say this too, as someone who like has been very interested in true crime resurgence that's happened, or like thinking about things like the trial. Like, I feel like there's been this sort of backlash often since the OJ trial of like, what's wrong with our society that people are so obsessed with this. And it's fascinating to me that you said it yourself, McGee, like you were calling it the Maury Povich or whatever. Like, here, like, one, it's the narrator, but two, it's Dostoevsky, right? Like, he basically in the middle of this great novel full of philosophy is like, and now we'll have like a crime procedural where I walk you step by step through the trial. And it's kind of boring to us as readers, but it was reminding me so much of like all the crime procedurals that continue to be some of the big TV like bestsellers. I don't know, like I found that really fascinating that like we had a mystery part and now we're getting like the end of Law and Order. Like this is that, you know, because again, this section would have come out separate from some of the others. So this was like our monthly installment from Dostoevsky was. I always find it interesting when people are like, what's happened to society? And it's like Dostoevsky knew people love a trial. They love the scandal of it, right? Like,
yeah. And I think it's actually a brilliant and very modern feeling courtroom narrative or whatever. I think it's actually really well written and engaging. My problem is I've already read this once recently, and I just feel a little fatigued to read the prosecutor's speech again, as you can understand. But I do think it's really well written, and it still turns the pages quite well, I think. So I slightly retract my previous statement. I do enjoy the section of the book, but it definitely feels like a drop off a little bit in like the intellectual intensity of it or something, to me. Maybe that's not even fair.
Well, I think it's not quite as philosophical, certainly, as, you know, it's not really addressing the big questions. It's now getting into this, you know, more societal commentary. Like, here's the way this court case, and I agree with most, like, and what you were saying, has a very, very modern feel. Like, here's this court case that really looks and sounds a lot like all this, you know, trash TV kind of stuff that exists now. And I think for me, it's painful because we've basically been inside Dmitri's head, and we've then heard Smerdykov's confession, and then we've seen Ivan's torment, and now suddenly we're in a place where no one has seen all of that, and they're going on this overwhelming evidence that contradicts what we know as readers to be true, and it's painful.
Thank you for articulating that.
To see this hype and this whole society and this whole country of Russia being carried away by stuff that we know isn't true. It's painful to read.
Yeah, I think you've articulated that beautifully. You know, which is that's a certain form of irony. Is that dramatic irony? I forget which one it is, but the audience knows more than the characters on stage or whatever. And painful is exactly right. This is just, it's about as, I think it's even more painful than the interrogation chapters, you know, because like you said, we have more facts now. And just everything overwhelmingly contradicts the facts that we know. And it's, yeah, painful is exactly right. And you saying that actually really convinced me how kind of brilliant that was as an author to do that, because it really drives you forward, like out of frustration, if nothing else. So I think the other thing that strikes me about this chapter is just the portrait it paints of Dmitri, who he just can't behave. Like, he does this weird military march into the courtroom, which all the doctors will comment on later and say which direction he should have been looking if he's sane. But like all throughout the whole trial, he just has these ridiculous outbursts over and over again that are completely improper, and the judge has to keep getting more and more stern with him. And in this chapter, we get his exclamation about Smerdukov, "The dog died like a dog." And then they ask him, "How do you plead?" And he gives this long, flowery, like unnecessary speech about pleading guilty to drunkenness and depravity, to idleness and debauchery. I intended to become an honest man ever after, precisely at that moment when fate cut me down. But of the death of the old man, my enemy and my father, I am not guilty. Of robbing him, no, not guilty, and I could not be guilty. Dmitry Karamazov is a scoundrel, but not a thief. You could just imagine this happening in a court and how, like, not in good order this is, and how sort of uncomfortable that would be. Like, it's like completely lacking any sense of awareness of the gravity of, the moment and the right. And he's just damaging himself so bad. And that's painful too. Like, every time you speak up, it makes people hate you more. Shall we move to chapter 2, Dangerous Witnesses?
Let's.
So this is the beginning of the witnesses giving their testimonies, and like very quickly, the narrator says, the facts were focused and began falling together, and all the horror and blood began gradually to emerge. And it became clear to everyone from the very outset that this was not a controversial case at all, that there were no doubts here. That essentially, there's no need for any debate. So, like, pretty much as soon as this thing starts, it's already over and pretty clear to everyone. And that's where you get the interesting comment that that this is all the ladies, strangely enough, remained utterly convinced to the very last moment that he'd be acquitted. He's guilty, but he'll be acquitted because of the humaneness, because of the new ideas, because of the new feelings that are going around nowadays, which I guess we already talked about. But this is the moment where that happens. So I guess this is mainly Grigory and Rakitin.
Yeah, why doesn't Grigory know what year it is?
That's a great question. I mean, he did get hit on the head pretty hard, so...
That was sadly one of the things I was thinking. Like, obviously he's also a very traditional figure, and maybe just, like, not interested in what's new, including...
I'm not interested in the new year. I thought 2016 was a good year, and I'm just staying there.
2016 was a terrible year, but I get you.
Well, it was eventually terrible, yes.
I thought it was interesting in this chapter, the whole technique of the defense attorney trying to discredit the witnesses. Oh, like, well, maybe you're drunk, or maybe, you're not a good person, and so we shouldn't listen to you. I mean, there's just... that's the type of thing that, like, usually in these sorts of, like, crime dramas and modern things that I really hate, because I'm like, it doesn't matter if the witness is a good person if they're telling what they witnessed. But then in this case, because I'm rooting for Dimitri so much, it just, like, flips the way I thought about it.
But also,
I think his points are exceedingly fair, although that is because we also have, you know, the facts too. So, but it's like Gregor got smacked on the head and was drunk. And the door, he didn't see the door open, but he stubbornly insists that he did, you know? And Borisovich, Trifon Borisovich, the innkeeper, is about as corrupt as you can get, you know?
What I thought was interesting about that technique is that it seems like kind of nobody really cares about the facts of the case, or they're sort of maybe Kirillovich a little bit, but like the narrator says they're not in dispute pretty much from the start. Everybody agrees what actually happened. All that matters is whether the people involved were good people or bad people. So Fetyukovich tries to cast doubt on everybody. Like Ivan doesn't care that he didn't literally kill anybody. All that matters is that he's a bad person. Dmitri doesn't seem to care like what happens to him, and keeps kind of reviewing the witnesses. It's like Smerdikov bad, Herzenstube good. Everybody's. It's mostly just about other people's characters rather than the facts. But it's not just Fetyukovich who thinks so. Fetyukovich.
I love that Dmitri refers to his father as that Aesop and that Pirot.
Yeah, I didn't quite get that reference. Can someone enlighten me?
He's been calling him those names for a while, and I don't know why they call him Aesop, but he and Ivan have both done it in the past, and it's just so completely inappropriate in court.
Is it just because he's a fabulous, like, you know?
I think
like Aesop?
with Aesop, it's just it's like ironic. He's the opposite of any wise old man, you know.
I don't think Fyodor's stories have morals.
Yeah. Who else was surprised and shocked when they found out Rakitin had written a pamphlet called "The Life of the Elder Father Zosima Fallen Asleep in God"?
Yeah, what?
0% surprised by that. Like he's the the emblematic self-promoter, leveraging himself, playing every side. That's his trope, right?
Yeah. Boy, does Rakitin continually look terrible. It's easy to hate that guy.
He's just the worst type of person.
I feel like my brain is still going kind of slow because of the sugar problems, but I want to point out that something is based off of what Jason was saying. Like, there's something going on that feels connected to earlier in the book when we were talking so much about Fyodor trying to like perform being an ass just for the beauty of it, right? Or people making scenes just for the beauty of it. There's something full circle about watching all of these witnesses kind of do that in court, but now we have a literal audience that at the end of the chapter is going to comment for us, right? Like, I don't know. Like, that's where I'm like, my brain is too slow to really figure out what's the point here, but there seems to be some comment about like, okay, so yeah, we do all these things, and even in court, like that's part of the problem of trial by jury, right? Like, is they're just performing for these people, they're performing for each other, they're performing for the public. It's all just, I mean, Rakitin especially, I feel like that's partly why he looks like such a jerk, but that's all it is, right? And I feel like that's part of the defense attorney's point. Everything is just impressions to a certain extent. I don't know. Yeah.
The way that I kind of intuitively tried to unite those kind of themes was that we've talked so much about how people try to people like to conceal themselves within a narrative, or tell themselves a story about what they are and who they are and why they do the things they do. And the trial is sort of doing it for other people. You just, the ladies want to impose this like narrative, tragic hero narrative on Dmitri and so on. But I think that's also maybe part of why some of it reads as less compelling, because it's just less psychologically interesting, or maybe more psychologically obvious that we do that with other people than that we do it with ourselves.
I guess in some ways this would make Fetyukovich the negative elder that forcibly bursts people's bubbles. Because Rakitin sure gets a takedown, and Borisovich too. Like pretty much all of them get a takedown when they puff up like that. The Poles, I like how the is that this chapter or the next, where the Polish guy gets really, he gets all carried away and by the end is speaking purely in Polish because he's so pleased with himself. And then they're like, but you were
cheating at cards.
That's the chapter. Yeah. But at the same time, it's like he's not just forcibly taking other people down. Like he's going to create his own myth about Mitya, right? About Dmitri. Like that's part of what's interesting.
Well, we haven't gotten to that, sweetie.
No, I know, but I'm just saying, like, even though we haven't read those chapters, like that's the whole point of a defense attorney, right? Like if Father Zosima is saying, don't be so ashamed of yourself, like no one in this court is really, like, this circles back to no one's really interested in the facts, and that's just a truth you learn if you're interested ever in court procedurals, right? Everyone's trying to tell some coherent narrative, and you're just trying to tell the narrative that's going to stick the most. So that's where it's like another way of saying he's the anti-Zosima, even in what we've seen so far. Like he's just trying to tell his own version of events, right?
It seems like a lot of these characters on the stand are like they're utilizing as their own little like soapbox that they can like improve themselves while also like dashing somebody else, like tell their own little fables, stories, whatever they want to do, like while they have the attention. Like this feels great, I'm gonna like do this, whatever story I need to do, and like the defense attorney comes in like, well actually you're just like a cheat. Which is pretty great, but it's like it's so interesting and so like typical human nature, like to self-aggrandize when you have the spotlight. But
man, what's up with Rakitin even hitting up Dmitri for loans in prison? Like, also, what money does he have anyway at this point?
Nobody said Rakitin was bright. Actually, that's a lie. Everybody says Rakitin is bright, which is what's awful about it.
A despicable Bernard careerist.
That's the line.
I'm sad that we don't get to hear Rakitin go off about the serfs and how much he feels about them. We just hear about it later.
Yeah. I'm not real sad about that, but yeah, I think that we should all make a concerted effort to get Bernard entered into the contemporary slang, kind of along the lines of jabroni. Yeah.
Dude's a total Bernard.
And for those of you Brothers K people, and I mean David James Duncan, I feel like Dostoevsky is really pushing this one a little too hard, just like yak butter. in David James Duncan, like how he came up with Bernard to be such a terrible thing when it was just the name of a scientist that he heard in passing, and all of a sudden it's his like #1 insult. I don't really fully follow, but that's Dmitri. Like he doesn't, you know, he doesn't outline his reasoning clearly. So
that's true.
Onward, medical expertise and 1 pound of nuts.
Three doctors walk into a courtroom. Each weird chapter, weird joke.
This whole thing was a really heavy-handed slap at the medical profession, right? 3 doctors, 3 opinions, all nonsense.
Yuck, yuck, yuck.
It also fascinated me because it did remind me so much of a modern crime procedural, right? Which I know we have more advanced psychology, but if someone's eyes look up to the right, they're accessing this part of their brain, right? Like to me, that's always been a bit like, yeah, there's only so much you can do. So it's really interesting to see it like spooled back like more than a century, and then being like, oh well, if you look in this direction, I don't know, like it really, that part was interesting to me because it felt so much like a modern procedural where we're getting all of those step by step, like, well, in the interrogation the person did this with their fingers and therefore, yeah.
Or like how modern procedurals all use lie detector tests, which like pretty much even the guy who invented it has admitted by now that they're bullshit and we still rely on them.
I thought those are not admissible evidence.
Oh, maybe they aren't anymore, but they still are like on TV. But maybe not in real life.
I don't think it's admissible evidence in court.
It depends on the state.
Okay. See, you know a lot more about it than I do.
Yes, sadly.
I'll tell you what's sad. I was on jury duty 2 weeks ago. And so this all actually feels very like fresh and immediate. It's all like, I'm like, wow, it was pretty similar in 19th century Russia to what I saw here in Wilmington right now. But the process of selecting a jury, boy, was that discouraging.
Sorry.
I just lost all faith in our justice system in one day because like these people would go up there and the lawyers would be asking them questions like, so do you understand the principle that the defendant is innocent until proven guilty and is under no obligation to present his side of the case, doesn't have to testify, and you won't hold that against them? And people are like, well, I don't know. I'd like to hear both sides before I make up my mind. And it's like, or the other one that I really loved was how many people hesitated when they were asked, you know, the defendant is innocent of the crime unless proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, and the burden of proof is on the state. Do you feel that to prove this beyond a reasonable doubt to you? Do you feel that is an undue burden? And people are like, well, I mean, it does seem kind of high. It's like, oh God. And some of these people still end up on the jury. So sorry, I walked out of there like pretty furious. Oh man.
Good for America.
I was like, you don't understand the basic principles of this country.
Well, now that we're all too depressed to go on,
I want to read some lines that I dedicate to my friend Michael Taggy. This is a doctor's analysis of Dmitri. Even the day before yesterday, during a conversation with me, he had an inexplicable fixed look in his eyes, unexpected laughter when it was quite uncalled for, incomprehensible constant irritation, strange words, Bernard and ethics, and others that were uncalled for.
So that's more like a conversation I have with you.
Yeah, that's. I've learned to track though.
I don't know about those ethics. Those ethics are really uncalled for in this situation. Okay, I'm going to just jump a little bit, I mean, still within this chapter, but to the bit about the pound of nuts and how, like, kind of out of nowhere, he's like, but here's this sweet story about how I made friends with him when he was a little boy, and I was, like, the only adult who did this nice thing for him ever in his entire childhood.
Yeah.
And, like, how that's really sweet and also sad. And also, like, in order to get this treat from me, I have to teach you how to talk about God in German. Also amused me.
Yes, this is very necessary.
Just out, and it just seemed kind of out of nowhere.
Yeah, he just seemed to suddenly remember this story. But it seems important. It's like a little human touch. Like one person, there have been a couple people like this, and I thought it was very moving, who, even though they may be convinced Dmitri is guilty, are still treating him as a human being. And one of them was the commissioner, the police commissioner, Maury Povich, or whatever his name was, that like let him see Grushenka or reassured him about her back then. Someone slipped a pillow underneath his head when he fell asleep. And then there was also Kalganov, who ran up and shook his hand, you know. So damn decent of you, you know.
Well, it made me think of Grushenka's story about the little onion, right? The one onion you could hand to people. And I feel like that's been a sort of recurring theme that we also saw in the story of Ilyusha, right? Like, it's another way of thinking about this ripple effect, about how you can do a small thing for someone, or a small moment of kindness might change a person's entire character. And I feel like that's partly why that story, even though it's kind of out of nowhere, like it humanizes him, right? And that's one of the things defense attorney is always trying to do, is show you that this person is a human. But it was this like one moment of kindness that breaks outside of the system for a minute.
All right, shall we move on to Fortune Smiles on Mitya? So this is Alyosha's testimony, where he suddenly remembers about the, you know, beating the chest. And then we have Katerina.
Actually, I just came up with something from the previous chapter that I wanted to bring up. Sorry to interrupt, but I just think about like these doctors and how it ends up with like him talking about the story of the nuts, right? So here's the doctors that are like trying to do what's that word? Dissect him into like these whole like forms of little actions or something like that, like dehumanize it more or less. And then the chapter kind of comes around full circle with like a full view of Dmitri as a person. So it's like, I think that's a very interesting like contrast between those two. So often in medicine anyway, it's like you don't even look at the person, you just look at the symptoms. And you see that happening here in the courtroom with the doctor's testimony. They're not even looking at Dmitri as a thing, and they're just putting him in their own little boxes of what diagnosis they needs to have. But like, and then it comes out full circle with Dmitri's actually a real person that's not just going to be put into a little box. So, but we can move on now. Sorry.
Well, no, now that you've taken us back to that chapter, I'm going to point out one other little perfection of Dostoevsky here, which is completely nailing when a German tries to tell a joke or a quip and completely botches it. He's trying, but the Russian proverb says, "It is good when someone has one head, but when an intelligent man comes to visit, it is better still." Or then there will be 2 heads and not just one. And they're like, so you mean 2 heads are better than 1? Does anyone want to say anything about Alyosha's testimony? I think that's fairly straightforward. He just kind of suddenly remembers, oh yeah. Maybe he was talking about the money when he was hitting his chest and saying these cryptic, weird Dmitri things. Because we certainly have lots to talk about with Katya.
I think with Alyosha, if there's one thing I would say, it's like it's kind of interesting to see like how what he says is basically like just completely like ignored. But like here's Alyosha, who's like known in the community for being like this like great person and stuff. But like even when he's in the courtroom, he's not like telling this thing. Is just like, oh yeah, whatever. You don't really have any sort of real evidence, so like you don't, whatever.
Well, sadly, he doesn't have any real evidence, so there's that problem.
Well, I mean, it's just in contrast to all the other stuff with like these crazy made-up stories, where I find like the crazy made-up stories are taken at a higher value than Alyosha's. But Alyosha would be the more dependable person in terms of the character than all the non-dependable people that are giving all these testimonies that are taken at face value that also don't really have a lot of evidence either.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. Yeah, because I feel like that's something I sort of felt but couldn't put into words when I was reading it. I think it's Alyosha's at a disadvantage because he's not willing to embroider the truth, shall we say. He's not willing to like fabricate this story or, you know, take what he thinks or what he thinks he knows or what he might know or what he guesses and make this whole narrative out of it, because that's so out of character for him. Like, he's telling the truth, plain and simple. I don't have proof, but I believe this. And yeah, like you say, he should be the most credible one, but because he hasn't played into this courtroom drama and constructed a narrative, it's not compelling to the jury and to the audience.
All right, so get your lorgnettes and opera glasses because Katerina's going on the stand. Did anyone else look up lorgnette? Because I had to look. That's like the glasses that you hold up like on a stick.
No need when you're a 19th century lit nerd.
So here we get the really astonishing revelation from Katerina that she supposedly gave the 3,000 rubles to Dmitri, knowing full well that he was going to just spend them and that she basically intended it as a test. You know, didn't really think he would dare actually take it. And that she also conveyed this to him with like a very knowing look or something, which this reminded me a lot of Smerdikov talking to Ivan. Like, wasn't this all totally obvious? Because I said you should go to Chermashnya, and by that you should have known that I meant blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I don't think this is real obvious at all, Katerina. Also, when I read this the last time and I got to this point, I was like, is this even true? I remembered there seeming to be some sort of fact that contradicted this testimony. And I went back and looked at the things that had been told to us earlier about the money that she gave him. And either the timeline didn't match or something was weird about it. Like, so I didn't bother to look through again, and that's my impression from my last read. But did anyone else feel like this was, how much of this testimony about the money do you buy from Katerina? I'm curious what you make of this little section.
Yeah, I did not go back and review any previous chapters. I didn't have a chance and didn't really want to interrupt my reading of this week's reading. But I kind of had a gut feeling that maybe Katya is kind of twisting the truth around here to protect Dmitri. Like, I don't have any evidence to back that up, but I feel like that would be in character for her.
It seems to me, and feel free to comment about any of her testimony now, I guess. But it seems to me that she's trying to do a kind of double-edged sword thing here, where on the one hand, she's trying to present a certain testimony that will maybe help favor him in the trial. But at the same time, she also knows that she's personally punishing him by revealing a lot of these details. And so there's a bit of revenge going on. Do you guys agree with that assessment?
I mean, you know what they say, hell hath no fury.
That's what I wrote down.
She is that woman of great wrath by his own description.
She has been scorned.
I also feel like for a while, like they were on a saving each other competition, right? Like forget like politeness fight. It was like, no, I'm saving you. No, I'm saving you. And this would be the ultimate saving him, right? Like that's where to me it feels like partly it's humiliating him and making him look like a thief in public, but partly if she got him off from this trial, it would be like, ha! Like I feel like she's felt scorned ever since she had to come and ask for the money. And she wanted to save him all along, right? Even when he was making her miserable. So now she could totally do it. Like, that would be her greatest revenge, proving that she is truly noble.
Yeah, and even
so it's interesting, like, Dimitri's not a thief, but he's a scoundrel, and Katerina's not a scoundrel. She's, like, the noble one, while acting like a scoundrel at the same time. It's kind of funny.
Even the narrator seemed to notice this dynamic when she starts to give the testimony about the coming for money and the bow and all that. He says, "This was something tremendous. I had chills and trembled as I listened. The courtroom was dead silent, grasping every word. Here was an unparalleled thing, so that even from such an imperious and contemptuously proud girl as she was, such extremely frank testimony, such sacrifice, such self-immolation was almost impossible to expect." And here we go. And for what? For whom? To save her betrayer and offender, at least somehow, at least slightly, contribute to his salvation by creating a good impression in his favor. But what's really interesting about that is, it has this effect on the whole courtroom. It does have the positive effect as intended. And what immediately follows that is Dmitri gets up and says, "Katya, why have you ruined me?" And he bursts into loud sobs that could be heard all over the courtroom. He instantly restrained himself and again cried out, "Now I am condemned." Because I guess this was the revelation of his insect nature, or how big a scoundrel he was, although she didn't tell quite that part. But is that why do you guys think Dmitri reacts like this?
I couldn't put my finger on it. I couldn't decide whether it was because she has said too much or because she has not said enough. So maybe it's because she's revealed some of the stuff that he's embarrassed about. But frankly, that doesn't seem to make sense because she's clearly been a positive witness for him. And so I thought that it might have to do, like we've talked, like it seemed like one of the things that has been running through the book is that like radical honesty. It's only through confession that we can really, be purged of the sins that we've committed. And by telling this version of the truth that leaves out his scoundrelness, in that sense, she has condemned him, or sort of put him in this untenable position where he can either accept the gift and be a bad person, or reject it and do harm to her and also to himself. That was the closest I could come to making sense of it, aside from just Dmitri being Dmitri.
Or I just thought of this. I wonder if we're actually reading his remarks as too closely in sequence to the story about the bow. And is he perhaps actually ruined because she's told the full story of the 3,000, which was always his, line in the sand, like that he stole the 3,000, and that she fully illuminates that this is money I gave you to betray me and run off with that creature, so maybe that's what really gets to him. I don't know.
That was how I read it, because I feel like the one thing all the doctors agree on is that he has mania about this money, right? Like some of them think he's totally got fits of passion and but they all agree that there's something about the money that sets him off and he goes berserk and just like, and so I feel like, yeah, that was what I was reading it as, which is weird, but also so what we've come to expect from Dmitri, right? Like, he's up there talking about all the terrible crap he did. That's fine. But like you said, this line in the sand, like, if he keeps insisting I'm a scoundrel, but not a thief. Like, I'm this, but not a thief. And now they know that, like, not only was he a thief, that, like, because what's weird is even though Katya seems to be like telling this backwards version of history, Dmitri agrees, right? He's like, yes, I did look in your eyes and I knew that you were saying that to me. So he's kind of like put on the stand that he looked her in the eyes, knew he was going to take her money and steal it. And now everyone knows that.
I wonder if it's like the revelation of like Katya thinking that he's just a thief that is like ruining him, like, because he's got this idea like, I need to be just a scoundrel but not a thief, and so when other people see me as a thief and here's the evidence against me, like, oh, that's incriminating, that's really bad, like, and now I'm everything that I've like kind of banked every sort of amount of self-worth or self-importance on is gone. Like, I've got nothing left. Like, yeah, I actually am a scoundrel and a thief, like, and that's actually my salvation, but I don't want to be a thief still,
I think there's an extra sting to it when the person you betrayed says, oh, you didn't have to worry about that money. You didn't steal it from me. I gave that to you to betray me if you want to. And I guess you did.
Well,
and we're even now because, I forgive your debt. But man, are you in debt to me, Well,
and the other thing is such a big part of his defense against the murder is that he didn't take his father's money. He still had half the money left from Katya because he didn't spend all of it. I mean, that's such a huge part of his defense. And if she had straight up given it to him, and if he didn't have the moral quandary of, am I a thief, because she straight up gave it to him, then why would he have reserved that half? Then his whole story kind of falls apart.
Mm-hmm. I do really appreciate that, like, we've spent these last few chapters kind of being weirded out by the fact that Dmitri keeps obsessing over the fact that he's not a thief, that he's everything else, but he's not a thief. And then the climax of the prosecution's argument, and the chapter or two from now, comes down to like the fact that, of course, Dmitri is a thief. And if people believed that he wasn't, then the prosecution's case would fall apart. On the flip side, so it's Dmitri was right about what was important about the case all along, in a weird way.
All right, so let's move on because next is Grushenka. And
I wanna say something else about Katya though, but like because
okay. Sorry, plenty of time to talk about Katya.
Okay.
I
was
thought
just
we were done.
waiting for us to finish talking about, because I do feel like one of the things that came up was, yes, at first everyone in the court is impressed, but this does start all of these rumors about her, right? Like the narrator is really insistent to point out that from this point forward, everyone in the town basically is talking crap about her behind her back, saying, oh, sure, I'm sure that he just bowed and gave you the money and nothing else happened. And I felt like that, I don't know, that was really interesting too, that this was definitely a like mutually assured destruction moment, right? That
Yeah.
he even goes on to say Katya knew this would happen. And I think I've brought this up before because Katya's a character that I just can't quite hate, even though I don't understand her. Like I find her so interesting. And just the fact that, yeah, this is a big deal. I mean, she ruined, it's funny that Dimitri says you ruined me. She ruined herself in the 19th century sense of the word, right? Like who's going to marry her now that the story is on the public record, that she accepted money from a gentleman under dubious circumstances that everyone is sure were a secret sexual liaison, right? Like, yeah. So I just felt like that was really, and like that we already, like, I know we haven't gotten to how her story ends at the court, but that already seems kind of just like wild to me that she's just like, cool, to save Dimitri, but also punish Dimitri, I'm going to destroy my public reputation.
Yeah, I think mutually assured destruction was like the perfect way of phrasing that.
Yeah.
Well, and also she's always had a martyr complex.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's also very in character for her, is playing the martyr.
The mad martyr.
Yeah, and she'll destroy herself again in
Right.
the next chapter in order to destroy Dimitri after Ivan collapses.
Yeah,
so,
it's like an anti-martyr.
So she's a woman of great wrath.
Right.
I kind of feel like I start to understand her in this chapter. I actually, like, she makes more sense to me now than ever, personally.
All right, now we can talk about Grushenka. I just like wanted to bring up that because I found it really interesting.
Yeah, so in full Maury Povich fashion, let's get both rivals in the same room and let them duke it out.
Surprised there wasn't any hair pulling or anything like that.
I was just going to say hair pulling. Nobody rolled in a vat of Jell-O.
No
Does
weaves
that
still on the
happen
floor.
these shows?
I don't know. I don't watch the
Oh,
show.
Well, hair pulling definitely did, but that wasn't Maury. Who was it that always... I forget.
Yeah, Jerry
Oh, it's the other guy.
Springer.
Jerry
Yeah,
Springer.
Springer. Jerry Springer. So Grushenka doesn't really try to hide her attitudes very much. She kind of tells them how it's going to be. Let's see. And she's a little bit like Dimitri in this, that she is just sort of blurting out insults too. Like that she refers to Smerdyakov as the villain. And then my favorite is this one, top of 683. They ask what are the grounds for her accusation of Smerdyakov. Dmitry Fyodorovich told me so himself, and you can believe him. It was that man-stealer who ruined him. That's what. She alone is the cause of everything. That's what. So now Katya is the man-stealer? What? Interesting. Seems a bit like projection. I don't understand how to read that comment.
Well, I thought she was referring to, because like the next paragraph, she sent for me once and treated me to chocolate and wanted to charm me. That refers to the meeting between Katya and Grushenka, where Katya thought that Grushenka was going to give Dmitry up and let Dmitry come back to her.
Yeah. I mean, it's just a little bit ironic to call the engaged fiance the man-stealer, isn't it?
Yes, but in that particular scene, Katya was trying to get Dmitry back from Grushenka. I mean, it's ironic, but
this is just like the height of Jerry Springer right here. Like the you know, the cheater is calling the legit person the man-stealer.
I also thought it was interesting on 682, the narrator, again, spends like a good part of a page talking about Grushenka's contradictions and how hers was a proud character which could not brook contempt. It at once flares up with wrath and the desire to strike back. But with that, of course, there was also timidity and an inner shame because of this timidity. So it was no wonder that she spoke unevenly, now angry, now contemptuous and overly rude, now suddenly with sincere, heartfelt note of self-condemnation, self-accusation, but sometimes she spoke as if she were flying into some sort of abyss. So the narrator spends a long time saying, like, she was all over the place, but it was understandable because of where she was coming from and because of her personality.
Yeah, and there's a pretty good little chain of psychological insight there about the the contempt, but also the timidity and an inner shame because of the timidity, like multiple chain reaction within yourself. You're like kind of disgusted seeing yourself play this out and then altering course based. Like, I find that very intelligible, you know, like getting more angered because I'm doing this the way I hate that I do this. You know, I hate this about myself. And so now it's really going to be bad. I mean, isn't that very typical of Dostoevsky's psychological insight?
And it's also interesting because and frustrating because it's exactly that kind of admission of the contradictions people hold in themselves. That's that kind of understanding that Dmitri doesn't get in the prosecutor speech. The prosecutor keeps saying, like, it's impossible for one person to behave one way, behave rationally at one moment, and then irrationally the next, and then rationally again later. That's just crazy. But that's exactly how people are, and it's and I think part of the pain that Ginny was talking about earlier comes from our awareness that, like, we keep wanting to say, well, yeah, but that's just how it was. That's sometimes how people are. It doesn't make sense.
The narrator is definitely a better psychologist than Ippolit Kirillovich. I always like to draw these parallels between Grushenka and Katerina. And the one that I find here is that last line that Jenny read, but sometimes she spoke as if she were flying into some sort of abyss. I don't care what comes of it. I'll say it anyway, you know. That's definitely a similarity. And we trash for Keaton a little bit again.
Their family.
Yes. That's what I was trying to say with my mic muted, that we find out Keaton is Grushenka's cousin.
That's wild.
That made me laugh out loud. I'd forgotten about that.
That's probably the only reason he wasn't hitting on her.
Ew.
All right, shall we move on to Chapter 5, A Sudden Catastrophe. And the catastrophe is Yvonne. So this is a pretty fascinating and tragic end to the Yvonne saga. You can see that he's torn up until the very last minute about whether he's going to bring forward his new revelation or not, because he initially announces, you know, I've got something for you, with this kind of cryptic grin. And then they're like, you have something special to say? And he's like, no. Actually, I don't feel well. May I go? And then he starts walking away. And then he's like, wait a minute. I am going to tell you. And now it's coming out all crazy. And boy, does it come out crazy on 686. Where'd you get this money? From Smerdukov. He killed him on my instructions. Who doesn't wish for his father's death? I don't know if this is a jab at Freud. Or just pure insanity. And then yeah, just crazy outbursts. And I think what's really interesting is in his crazy outbursts, they kind of gather together all sorts of different themes and aspects from other parts of the book. So we had a section earlier. I forget who was talking. Actually, I think it was Lise was saying how people are all lying and they love this parricide, you know. And Ivan goes on about that for a minute or two. A murdered father and they pretend to be frightened, you know. They pull faces at each other. Liars. Everyone wants his father dead. If there were no parricide, they'd all get angry and go home in a foul temper. Circuses, bred in circuses. And then, calm yourselves. I'm not mad. I'm simply a murderer. One really cannot expect eloquence from a murderer, he said with a twisted laugh. I think, and then here's where it really comes together is his, I'm going to borrow a phrase I got from Aaron, or his kind of word salad on 687, where it's just complete breakdown. Who is your witness? He's got a tail, Your Honor. You'd find him inadmissible. Le diable n'existe. I'm sorry, no French. Pay no mind to him. He's a wretched, paltry devil. He's sure to be here somewhere. There under the table with the material evidence. Where else would he be sitting? You see, listen to me. I told him I would not keep silent, and he started telling me about the geological cataclysm. So there we have the reference back to his long conversation with the devil. Well, set the monster free. He's begun his hymn, so now there's Dimitri's, you know, underground hallelujah thing. Because he finds it all so easy. The same as if some drunken lout started brawling that Thank has gone to Petersburg, which was what the drunk guy was singing that he pushed over in the street. But I'd give a quadrillion for 2 seconds of joy. So there's a story about, you know, the atheist that eventually walked to salvation, and I guess he's associating Dimitri with that, with his hymn. I didn't notice all this. I found this to be complete gibberish the last time I read it, but I suddenly realized this is flashbacks to like 10 different points in the story. I thought that was actually pretty cool to bring this all together at this moment.
And to have it come across as completely incoherent. Yeah.
Right. It's the stuff he's been thinking about so much.
It's kind of uncharitable to say that it comes easy to Dimitri because he has his hymn.
Yeah. And not surprisingly, they don't really go anywhere with this testimony. I think what's really interesting to me is that he seems to have revealed that he was debating with the devil about whether or not he was going to give this testimony. And he seems to have actually won that struggle. But it's, you know, it's too late and it's all coming out like insane gibberish. And strikingly, you know what this actually reminded me of? Very parallel to the story of Zosima's strange visitor after he abandons the duel, and the man who committed murder secretly, like, can't decide whether he's gonna tell on himself or not, and finally makes up his mind to do it, and then they all just decide that he's insane. Well, Dmitri has actually come to accept that he's in some way accountable for this. That he's at least connected. And I find this to be a bizarre reversal of what seems to be a sort of salvific moment in The Strange Visitor is kind of the opposite here for Ivan, because it's like he has evidently overcome some sort of spiritual struggle in himself to the point of deciding to, you know, share the facts that he's found out and accept some degree of complicity in it. Maybe too much, but you know, it's not received at all. And in this case, that's a devastatingly bad outcome. So what do you guys make of Ivan's confession here? Is this a moral victory for him, or is it like it's like he's already mucked it up somehow because it has no effect and he's still stuck in some way inside that's not letting him break through? Or is this just, I don't know, the ravings of a lunatic? What do you guys think?
I mean, I also couldn't help but draw parallels to his opening, like when we first meet Ivan in Father Zosima's chambers, and I hadn't even connected it till this reading that he wrote his article about the courts, right? He's thinking about the courts, and there he's not invested. He doesn't seem to have a clear opinion, but he can hold all these multiple ideas together in this coherent way, and everyone, like, it's the opposite, right? Like, no one will listen to him here, but then when he's talking about the courts, everyone believed him, and everyone thought he was on their side. He'd somehow, I guess I'm just thinking about this as an academic too, as someone who like can hold so many ideas together at once. He was very good at doing that, and he did that in that article, and that was how he got this following. And now we see like the exact opposite, where he's trying to hold all these ideas together and they've just kind of disintegrated into a pile. But it's because he's so invested, right? Like that to me, I don't know, again, quite what to make of it, but there's some great irony that when he wasn't invested, when he was just playing with the ideas of the courts, he was able to do this great eloquence and move between positions. And now that he cares, it's like breaking him. And he's still putting out all these ideas, but yeah, they just aren't connecting. And thus everyone just thinks he's crazy. So, like, again, it seems also tied to some of these ideas that, like, we have to perform the truth a certain way before people will hear it. And the fact that he's not, I mean, clearly he does sound, I don't think people are wrong to think he sounds unhinged here, but it's also just this idea that what we look for is a sort of coherent performance of a narrative rather than the truth. Because the other thing that popped into my mind is just as someone who cares a lot about, you know, is really interested in procedurals, this seems like in the modern parlance what we would call reasonable doubt, right? Even if he sounds crazy, if someone shows up at a trial saying I was complicit in helping someone else murder him, like that shifts the whole trial. You at least get a mistrial out of it. And yet this just seems to be like, well, send him off to the doctor for a brain fever diagnosis and let's move on, which is weird.
I mean, to be fair, he does have brain fever. Like, he's not making sense. I do like what you're saying about being emotionally invested or not making a difference. I think that's a really fascinating aspect of this. But that's also not the only aspect. Like, he's legit sick. He's been hallucinating the devil. So
my other point was just, even if someone shows up and is crazy, that's the kind of thing that will derail a modern trial. And I don't know if this is just like early court systems or like earlier psychology. It seems weird that even if he is raving and crazy, that everyone's just like, no reasonable doubt, Dmitri still clearly did it, right? Like,
well, on the other hand, you say it should derail it and should cause a mistrial and like maybe does on TV. But I think in real life, you're going to get a lot more cases like this, where just everybody's confirmation bias has just already decided, the judge, the jury, the lawyers, everybody. Like, I feel like a lot of legit reasonable doubt does not actually get taken into consideration in our court system. And I feel like maybe this is an example of Dostoevsky writing a lot more realistically than most of the fiction we encounter today.
Yeah, and again, it's, you know, he hasn't really presented any real evidence. It's like, hey, I've got $3,000 and I'm raving mad, and I'm telling you my brother's innocent. You know, it's like not a very convincing witness at all.
What I really felt at this point, I felt like Alyosha should have stood up again and told them about what he saw last night, but then I didn't actually go back and reread. Did Ivan clearly tell Alyosha that he got a confession from Smerdyakov? Because he was kind of ranting and already talking to the devil by the time Alyosha showed up. So, like, maybe Alyosha doesn't know, but I feel like Alyosha at least had some idea that Ivan was maybe going to confess, and that it really was Smerdyakov, but then it was messed up because he killed himself. And I feel like Alyosha could have said that more clearly. Like, still wouldn't have had hard evidence, but could have at least said, like, this is what Ivan's trying to say. He's just too sick to say it. I don't know if anybody else had that thought, but
I can't remember what he actually told Alyosha, and I'm looking back to check now. But I don't think he actually told him what he had found out. It doesn't, but I'm not sure. I'm not going to just put everything on hold while I flip through the pages. So that's an interesting question. That's the problem with this book. It's too big and you forget the, details when you need them. You have to remember, especially if you don't read it fast. Michael, would you care to weigh in on your impressions of Ivan here?
I don't know if I have anything poignant to say at the moment.
I'll just point out what the footnote said in case people didn't refer back to this. But the language that's used as he's being taken out of the courtroom, that he cried out with a frenzied cry, is a biblical phrase based on Hebrew phrasing that is basically used of the demon possessed in the New Testament. So it is, suggesting, or it's meant to make a connection there. And that sort of language was also used, by the way, of their mother, the shrieker.
So would that implication of possession suggest that this is not a moment of triumph for Ivan? Well, I guess moment of triumph would be overstating it regardless. But that this is not a victory over Satan, since he is still sort of possessed of whatever the sickness is that was sickening him?
I think that's the interesting question to ask here. Is this a moral victory for Ivan or not in his inner struggle with the devil? And I'm not sure. It's like, I think it is, in the sense that he's decided to share the evidence and not conceal it and to implicate himself in it. But it's perhaps a failure because he's waited until this moment to do it. And so, he kind of knew early. That's the problem with Ivan. Like, he sometimes gets the sense, he gets like a gut feeling that he should or shouldn't do something. Like, when he's talking to Smerdyakov, something's up with this. It feels wrong. I'm a scoundrel to leave tonight. He got the idea last night that he should present this immediately to, present this new information to the authorities, but he decides to sleep on it. So I don't know. Like, it definitely seems like he's still in trouble inside, but that this was a breakthrough that the devil was saying, you're never going to do that. And then he does do it. So it's only a minor internal thing because it's too late to save his brother, so I'm not sure how to read that. Things look bad for Ivan.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree. It's at least a small victory. I mean, victory might be too strong a word, even like you all were saying. But there is something to the fact that even after this struggle and after sleeping on it, and with the devil still taunting him from like underneath the table in the courtroom or whatever he says, that like he's still attempting to give evidence.
And the other, so I do think that's significant for him, and it's also significant for him to admit guilt. Like, he's kind of never, like his old ideas are do whatever you want, and there is no guilt, right? And here he's admitting it. This is the other interesting part, because Alyosha has been telling him, you're not guilty of our father. Like, you did not kill our father. He told him over and over again. Here he is proclaiming to the whole court, I killed him. So it's like he's taken that idea and gone too far with it. And this is interesting just to think about, like, is this it's interesting to see him kind of moving in the direction of a Zosima idea that I'm somehow responsible, even if I'm not directly responsible for someone else's fate. And that's a breakthrough for Ivan. But he seems like this seems to be saying you've taken that too far. And maybe that's just on the level that this is psychologically destroying you. You still can't like sit with the guilt or live with having made a mistake or something, Well,
and I feel like maybe it's because he's having to fight too hard and push too far to even give any evidence at all. I mean, we are looking at the circumstances that he's been arguing with the devil, who's been taunting him and saying he'll never give any evidence, plus which Smerdyakov killed himself, so Smerdyakov can't, corroborate anything or can't give his own evidence. So, like, it's just his word against the world. And I feel like he's having to fight through so much to even get to where he can even say anything in court, that like it almost makes sense in a weird way that when he's pushing that hard that he would kind of swing too far that direction towards accepting the guilt. I don't know if I'm expressing it clearly, but
yeah, because he's even accusing himself of having given instructions and of being an accomplice, legally, in the legal sense here. He accuses himself of that.
So that's clearly an idea that he picked up, or clearly, I don't know. That seems to be an idea that he picked up from Smerdyakov, which I guess I'm interested in only because, like, there's been so much talk about Ivan convincing Smerdyakov to do it, or Smerdyakov, somehow enacting Ivan's ideas, or Ivan has put, like, has in some ways done something to Smerdyakov that made him commit murder, and that's the sense in which Ivan feels guilty. But the infection also goes the other direction. Smerdyakov has made Ivan both consider himself to be a murderer, like he's incepted Ivan in a way.
You're right.
yeah.
But he's also, he has convinced Ivan to behave in ways that Ivan now feels are reprehensible. He tells him to go to Chermashnya and gives Ivan these. He causes Ivan to be pretty shitty. And also Smerdyakov was like pretty fucked up before Ivan got to him. he used to hang cats. So
yeah,
I'm on team anti Smerdikov. I don't know if there's anyone on pro Smerdikov team.
I'm a big fan.
I just want to
typical
in callback to Melissa's like mistrial thing. I think it seems really odd that Smerdikov commits suicide on the eve of the trial, and nobody's like, like, should we look into that a little bit? Like,
that's all I
was trying to say is like, okay, listen, so Smerdikov commits suicide. You've got a bunch of people saying they think he might have had something to do with it. We now know that Grigory drank a lot of vodka and is like one of the people that's saying Smerdikov was fine. I know Ivan might have gotten 3,000 rubles somewhere else, but we've talked before about that's like someone raving shows up in court with how much money is that, McGee? It's a huge amount of money, right? And everyone's just kind of like, oh, we'll put it on the material witness table. We'll, I'm like, there's all these crazy things happening. And between all of that, nobody's like, oh, well, we've got people killing themselves and people throwing around huge piles of money and people drinking tons of vodka and just like, no, let's just full steam ahead. Like that's all I've been trying to say. Is like there's a lot of weird stuff and nobody blinks. But then they're all like, oh, about like really small things. And it's like, what is happening?
This drinking vodka is not weird in Russia.
Well, that too. And also, I mean, confirmation bias. But I also thought that, because I feel like in modern crime procedurals, if like a potential suspect commits suicide, that's almost like an admission of guilt.
Yeah, and you would think at least they'd be like, well, time out. Let's talk to Ivan a little bit more when he's not raving after the doctor takes care of him, like. But no, they just steam forward with the trial, like.
Well, like, it's weird because so we haven't gotten there yet, but Katerina's about to break out the letter, but then she has hysterics, but then they're all like, still, let's read this out loud. Whereas they're like, oh, well, Ivan has brain fever, so 3,000 rubles, like, like who, you know what I mean? I'm like, what? Who's running this?
Well, and I was just about to bring that up and start to jump ahead to Katya bringing out the letter, because I think that if she hadn't, because like she's submitting, they think they already have this locked up evidence-wise, and she's submitting like kind of the final nail in the coffin. And I feel like if she hadn't done that, then they might have been like, hey, doctor, is Ivan okay? Can we figure that? I mean, who knows? Maybe. But the narrator certainly seems to think that if all this stuff hadn't happened, I don't know if he's directly referring to Katya, but I feel like that's kind of the culmination of all of this. If that hadn't happened, then, like, could have gone a completely different direction.
Yeah. So let's transition to Katya's what is someone refers to it as your serpent sting or something like that. Anyway, so let's talk a little bit about Katya and the letter. Why do you guys think that she breaks this out all of a sudden now?
So personally, I think that she has been, maybe back and forth at different points, in love with both brothers and not willing to admit it to herself even. So like her whole martyr complex and trying to save Mitya and all that we've been talking about is like maybe weird but totally in character for her. Now all of a sudden, like I think mostly subconsciously, she realizes she loves Ivan way more than she loves Dmitri, and so her martyr complex goes way this way, and she has to save Ivan. That's my read.
How is the saving Ivan, though?
Well, because Ivan's just admitted to murder.
Okay, yeah, you're right.
So she throws Dmitri under the bus. They're not going to come back to Ivan and say, "What do you mean you're the guilty one?"
Yeah, so that's right. So she jumps in and has to say, "Don't listen to him. He's raving. Dimitri's definitely guilty." It's saving Ivan from like being complicit or accomplice.
Right. So when
Yeah.
it was between Dmitri or Smerdyakov, of course she wants to save Dmitri. But if it's between Dmitri or Ivan, now she's saving Ivan. Like,
So-
it's who are you going to throw under the bus?
I think that's true, but I have a slightly different read or dynamic to add to this, which is I think at this point in the book, she pretty much hates Dmitri, and is really forcing herself by strain to, to be the savior out of this. Again, it's back to that, still have something to prove. I need to save you to get even. And in the same process, I'm punishing you by, sort of revealing the parts of your character that you absolutely can't stand to look at. And I actually think that a large part of the reason why she's trying to help Dmitri at this point is for Ivan's sake. Because Ivan wants to get him off the hook. I don't understand Ivan's motivation there, because Ivan seems to despise Dmitri. So I think a lot of it was for Ivan's sake that she was trying to help save Dmitri. And when Ivan suddenly keels over, and has maybe implicated himself in this, the kind of wrath that she feels towards Dmitri, there's like no reason to protect him anymore. If Ivan's trying to shift the blame on himself, she can't let that happen. And here comes this massive outpouring of wrath that's been stored up. Like, all her anger for how she's been betrayed by Dmitri suddenly pours out at once in this, and she's no longer the savior. She's now the accuser, so that's my, I guess, additional angle on what you said.
Yeah, and I think I don't really disagree with what you said. I think it can kind of fit on top of
yeah, exactly.
where I was coming. Yeah. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else have a hot take?
Katya actually loved Alyosha the whole time.
Katya loves everybody.
I mean, this is so just dorky, but I do think it's really funny what counts as evidence, right? He wrote a letter, but I don't know. It's weird that they're like, aha, this letter written by a drunk person on the back of a bill is proof. I don't know. That made me
I don't know. I think that having a letter by somebody saying, I'm going to kill this guy the day before, it's pretty good. It's,
Yeah, especially when it happens exactly the way that he wrote, I
mean, I love 12 Angry Men as much as the next guy, and things can be misleading, but
well, and that's the irony, right? Is it is misleading.
Sure.
But I mean, you look back at the night it happened, and even Dmitri thought he was going to kill his father, and then was stopped by the angels or whatever, and how do you put that into courtroom evidence? Oh no, I was standing there in the backyard with this weapon in my hand. I had a change of heart. That's great. It's wonderful. It makes for a compelling story, but it's not exactly hard courtroom evidence.
I'm just saying, I'm considering all the evidence we have collected in total. 3,000 rubles, nobody bats an eye. A letter from a drunk guy, that's hard. You know what I mean? There's really weird, and it's particularly weird if you know anything about modern courts, because they're we have all these bloody things, which if you're a 21st century reader, you're why haven't you invented DNA testing yet? That's all Grigory's blood.
I do think, though, if we didn't have the benefit of seeing all these chapters with Dmitri and stuff, this is a slam dunk, obvious guilty case, or at least it looks that way so far. We haven't heard the defense lawyer do a whole lot yet, but you know, if I were on the jury here, I'd be like, it's going to be awfully hard to clear this, you know. Although we should probably hear, what is Yvonne talking about?
Right?
Yeah.
And I do agree that there's a big discrepancy in what evidence they're considering significant. But I would say most of that's confirmation bias. Everybody walked into that courtroom thinking they already knew.
Back to Katerina, I want to point out some of her language changes. And it's just, this is what's so striking and sudden. It's like, it goes from this kind of help him out demeanor to 691. She starts calling him the monster. You know, and now she's furious because, and I think this is another part of the reason her anger comes out, is because she feels that it's Dimitri's fault that Ivan has driven himself mad. And so she loves Ivan, and he's seeing him go down to try and clear the monster is like, now there's rage that you're taking down my love. So, you know, it says the doctor examined Ivan and told me he was close to brain fever, all because of him, all because of the monster. Yesterday he learned Smerdyakov had died. He was so struck by it that he's lost his mind, all because of the monster, all to save the monster. And then there's this very kind of grave and fascinating passage from the narrator. You know, this is exactly once in a lifetime moment, and it's Katya's moment. The same woman who had just sacrificed herself and her maiden's honor before the whole public by telling of Mitya's noble conduct in order to soften the fate in store for him, in just the same way again sacrificed herself, this time for another man. And perhaps only now, only that minute, did she feel and realize fully how dear this other man was to her. So that, to the question of her motivations, here it is from the narrator. She sacrificed herself in fear for him, imagining suddenly that he had ruined himself with his testimony, that he and not his brother was the killer. And yet a terrible thought flashed through one's mind. Was she lying about Mitya and describing her former relations with him? That was my question earlier. But I thought this was an interesting page because the narrator tells you, you know, this is everything that happened in Katerina. And it goes on about, you know, do we accept that as the gospel, or is this man as a actual townsman at the trial? You know, it's I don't know which way we should accept this this report of Katerina's insides. Is this one man's opinion, or is this the godlike narrator that we have sometimes, you know? But it seems to fit.
I think it's one of the best explanations, but is it everything? I don't know if it is, but I think it's certainly a 8 out of 10, perhaps.
I think one of the really interesting insights we get from this narrator passage is that we find out that from the beginning she was deeply convinced, perhaps from the moment of the bow itself, that the guileless Mitya, who adored her even then, was laughing at her and despised her. So she's had the sense that he has been looking down on her for that bow from the very beginning, and that is actually not true. But you see how that wounded sense has driven her almost for all these years or whatever to a lot of this. And I just thought that was another, you know, great psychological insight when you know, when we read other people's motivations through our own lens, how often it can drive, you know, years-long rift or something like that. And Dmitri never thought anything like that. And then we find the whole motivation for why they were together, you know, only out of pride had she then attached herself to him with a hysterical and strained love, love out of wounded pride, a love that resembled not love but revenge. But perhaps this would have grown into real love.
And I think it's also interesting that I think it's implied, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but it says the moment of revenge came unexpectedly, which I think I take to mean that she wasn't really aware that she was harboring this much resentment over the course of their relationship. It wasn't a sort of conscious lying. It was just this thing within her. A lot of this book doubles as a great argument for therapy. Everyone should do it.
I'm kind of reminded of Yvonne's outburst at Katerina, you know, about how frustrated he was and how she's been, you know, like intentionally, you know, tormenting him or whatever. Although this is obviously more extreme. And then this is the moment I was referring to earlier. So hysterics ensue, and we get Grushenka and Dmitri trying to run to each other again in the chaos and being held back. And then Grushenka yells out, "Mitya, your serpent has destroyed you. See, she's shown you what she is." And that's great Jerry Springer.
And then the next paragraph is like, yeah, and all the ladies in the audience ate it up. All they wanted was to watch Jerry Springer.
The spectacle had been a rich one.
Well, and that's where I feel like, as crazed as Yvonne sounded, he also had a point with this whole thing about like, oh, you guys act so scared, but you all love a parasite, right? Like,
Right.
I know that he then went on to say like, serpent eats serpent and blah blah blah, but I do feel like partly he was pointing out people do love it, right? Like the whole town has shown up to watch this thing, and they can, like, there's this real interesting tension I feel like that's being drawn out between people who act so morally offended by these things but can't tear themselves away from it for a minute. I don't know, I'm just thinking this now, but it's like there's a difference between someone like Father Zosima who can point out you're doing something immoral and corrupt in this calm way versus like all these people that are like, oh dear God, no, don't kill your father, please do it so we can come to the trial, right? Like, I don't know, this sort of performance of virtue, which isn't virtue at all, because if you actually were horrified by this, why would you want to participate? Versus the calm, quiet way you would actually try to correct someone's behavior. And I'm not saying that judgmentally, as I've revealed multiple times, I'm fascinated by crime procedurals and all those sorts of things. So, yeah.
I find all these devil references, like between all these characters associated with Ivan, like whether in the previous reading and then this one, like the line, there seems to be a lot of references, and I don't know if that's intentional or not, but like everyone's calling each other the devil, they're doing all these demonic things. Like, is this like a theme? And I don't know. I'm not going to make a case for that, but I just find it interesting.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the like good spiritual influences in these chapters are few and far between. You know, maybe the doctor, a little bit of Alyosha, but most everyone seems to be at their worst here. Let's move on to the prosecutor's speech. The windbag.
That is that should be the chapter title.
I remember reading this, thinking, "Wow, they allowed the the lawyers to make speeches about completely off-topic, like social commentary crap," because this whole first chapter is nothing to do with the trial, and it's just like, all right, I've been waiting my whole life to make a statement about everything I believe, and here it is, you know.
Well, I think that's part of the brilliance, to be honest. I mean, it's like we had one of my previous comments was like how everyone gets up on the soapbox and then like reveal all this other random crap. Like here's this prosecutor attorney dude who's like well versed in it. He's just doing on a he takes it to 11 on the same exact thing. Like
it really reminded me of all the, like, this is America and this is, American values and this is what we're all about. Just kind of, what's the word I want? I don't know. People in this country in this time period being big windbags, I guess. But I mean, it has, very much this like it is very pseudo-political, nationalistic.
I love when very faint applause breaks out a couple times. Like 3 people clap for a second.
But he's so thrilled.
Yeah, it's like
He's never heard such approval.
But like, not enough applause for the judge to get really about it.
well, I see this whole entire thing as like a criticism of this prosecutor guy. Like his little applause is like greatly, deeply like fulfilling to his like little ego pride thing, and he's like saying all this random crap that like has nothing to do with the case. Like it's just him on his soapbox and like, I've always just been ignored my entire life, and I'm about to die in 9 months, because surely he died 9 months later, and like, that's brought up later, I think. Just like his swan song, like this is my moment, and I'm going to make it work. And like, here he is, like getting all this approval with like 3 people like doing like some sort of halfway clap or something like that. But it's like more approval than he's ever gotten. And here's his like show trial, and like he's so like invested into like proving himself to be right. Like he basically doesn't actually conduct a fair trial at all. Nor is it even like linked to the trial with his speech. Like it's just self-aggrandizing, like all the other witnesses.
That all said, I think he actually does get a couple things right and makes some fairly insightful points here and there.
Well, I'm not going to make the case he's all
one
wrong.
Of the no, but I think well, like here's the thing: we're going to have him, and we're going to have the defense lawyer, and I think the fact that Dostoevsky spends so much time on their speeches is significant, and they're going to represent some different views, and so I think it's worth asking what view are they representing socially, politically, or whatever. And a couple points I want to highlight from Kirillovich. 698, he highlights Dmitri as the characteristic Russian man or whatever. Like, this is Russian character writ large, ingenuous. Oh, we are ingenuous. We're an amazing mixture of good and evil. We are lovers of enlightenment and Schiller, and at the same time we rage in taverns and tear out the beards of little drunkards. We can also be good and beautiful, but only when we are feeling good and beautiful ourselves. We are, on the contrary, even precisely possessed by the noblest ideals, but only on condition that they be attained by themselves, that they fall on our plate from the sky, and so on and so forth. And then kind of, I think, getting this idea even more correct, on 699, about 3/4 of the way down, he's talking about the tensions and contradictions in Dmitri, and how can he be both the same person who had the impulse of lofty nobility to give away his last money, to Katerina, and then also the same person who steals her 3,000 to run off with another woman. And you know, is it that one is true and one is false? And he says, most likely in the first instance he was sincerely noble, and in the second just as sincerely base. Why? Precisely because we are of a broad Karamazovian nature. And this is what I'm driving at, capable of containing all possible opposites and of contemplating both abysses at once, the abyss above us, an abyss of lofty ideals, and the abyss beneath us, an abyss of the lowest and foulest degradation. I think Dmitri would 100% agree with that assessment. This is like the one point where he totally gets Dmitri right. Mm-hmm. What's weird is that he then abandons this idea later, as Jason was pointing out. He doesn't carry it through in his, you know, it's like impossible for him to imagine these moments later on, but he totally nails it here. Sure.
Although he literally follows it up like 3 sentences later with being like, so then how could a person like this sew up $1,500 in an amulet if he's going to be so extreme all the time? It's just
it's amazing how he kind of absolutely nails Dimitri's character, but he still kind of completely fails to understand his motivations. And that whole line in the sand as I can't steal thief thing, he just doesn't get it all.
Yeah, I find that like the biggest irony is the contradiction that's in the prosecutor that like can go ahead and like give this huge tirade or exposition about the character of the Russian people, but not see the Russian person standing right in front of him possessing all these traits, and then can't understand like exactly what Dimitri's doing. Like, it's like, but how could Dmitri do that? But he'd have to do exactly what I just said, like everyone does, like about 6 minutes ago in my speech. Like, it's just so weird and bizarre. Like at the very end of this like section, I don't know if it's even on this chapter or not. Like, but it's really close to the end of where the prosecutor's talking. Like, well, where he's like making his real case against Dmitri. Like, well, he's just a murderer. Like murderers can't think like that, or he's just a thief. Like thieves are only like capable of doing that. You know, it's like, but. And he's making this big case how like it's both extremes at the same time.
Well, and I think both, like, it's ironic that he can't see that what he's saying in one part of his speech doesn't hold up in another part of his speech. Or another way to read it is that he kind of does, but he's conveniently ignoring it because of his job as prosecutor. You know, and it's one of those kind of dangerous and scary things that like if I were in the courtroom again listening to this speech and like hadn't just been spending, you know, the past few days like seeing from our omniscient narrator what actually happened, I feel like I would be very drawn in by the beginning of the speech and like, oh yeah, he gets it, he nails it, he gets it, he nails it, and then maybe I wouldn't be able to see the contradictions later in the speech.
Yeah. I just felt like this was a moment that was bigger than the speech itself and was actually a theme of the book. This Karamazovian nature capable of comprehending 2 abysses. And Dmitri has philosophized about that himself, you know?
Yeah.
He kind of is decrying, you know, cynicism and moral decay. I don't know what's more cynical than like, here, this family is the archetype of what's wrong with our country, people, and attacking, you know, the Karamazovs of Russia. Whether that's, you know, talking about, you know, falsely, gratuitously acquired European Enlightenment, or, you know, Alios's belief system. You know, he seems to just attack everything, everybody indiscriminately, as he's saying. You know, it kind of came across as like kids these days, what about the good old days kind of a thing to me.
But it's interesting, like in this, like it's almost like a diatribe where he just like basically attacks everything and everyone. Like he even attacks Alyosha, like all this other stuff. Like, but he never actually puts forth his own views, or espouses those specifically. It's like maybe the good old days might be the best thing. It's like, well, we were never like this before, but now we are, and but like this just attack on everything, and then the result of basically overlooking everything at the end, I think, is like the biggest problem. Like he's so blind at the end, like that he can't incorporate all this stuff into an actual like perspective. Although he kind of picks up on a bunch of truths broadly, but when when the rubber hits the road, he can't nail it down.
I would like to talk for a minute about a little bit of new characterization we get about Smerdukov in this speech. And I don't know if you guys noticed, because it goes by fairly quickly, but he includes some testimony of Smerdukov that we didn't get to be privy to. This is the bottom of 696. And this is in the context of his critique of Ivan, you know, pointing out how Ivan is emblematic of certain problems in Russia. And I guess this would be the sort of improper or bad importation of Enlightenment ideas that misunderstood or whatever. But yesterday, a certain sick idiot died here on the outskirts of our town by suicide, a person much involved in the present case. The former servant and perhaps illegitimate son of Fyodor Pavlovich Smerdukov. This is what I find interesting. In the preliminary investigation, he told me with hysterical tears how this young Karamazov, Ivan Fyodorovich, had horrified him with his spiritual unrestraint. Everything, according to him, is permitted, whatever there is in the world, and from now on, nothing should be forbidden. That's what he kept teaching me about. It seems that this thesis which he was taught ultimately caused the idiot to lose his mind. And then he also makes the observation that that Smerdukov compared Ivan as the closest to Fyodor. But what do you make of this little detail from Smerdukov's testimony in the preliminary investigation? Sounds like horseshit to me. Hysterical tears, how Ivan had horrified him with his spiritual unrestraint. The first half sounds false. The second half actually sounds true when he says this teaching is what drove him out of his mind. I think it actually is true. When he did carry it out, you know, the moral outcome of having tried to live that idea did not sit well and ultimately led him to his suicide. So it's both true and false, I think.
Yeah, but the whole part about him being upset when Ivan first had the conversation about everything permitted, like, again, I didn't go back and reread this, but I'm pretty sure I remember Smerdukov being super not upset and super excited about this idea and super, like, wanting to be besties with Ivan after this conversation happened.
Yeah.
Unless my memory is totally wrong.
No, he seemed to hang on his every word.
Right.
And he was the one that was super excited about the idea of like, oh, like everything's permitted because if I recant my faith when I'm about to be martyred anyway, like who can, you know what I mean? Like he wasn't weeping and going, he was like having a fun time messing with Grigory about it. Like I'll make the old man cry by messing with him with this idea. So that to me seems like, I do think it's the thing that drove him crazy, but I don't think he's...
That he was corrupted by Ivan, and this seriously disturbed him.
Also, remember, like Smerdukov was the one who used to like murder cats for fun and like I'm just saying he wasn't like some innocent kid who'd never had a bad thought before, and then Yvonne suddenly corrupted him, right? Like, he already had some of these tendencies.
Yeah, and I'm not
Suicidal
sure
tendencies? Oh.
I'm not sure I 100% buy that, like, these ideas are what drove him crazy. I mean, maybe acting them out, like maybe the actual murder, you know, but I kind
That's
of
what
read
I mean.
that as a whole, like, you know, out damn spot. I mean, you know, to compare it to the Scottish play, like, Lady M is totally the one telling her husband, like, you gotta murder the king, and, you know, here's how you do it, and you can't chicken out or else you're not a man. And then she goes and, like, helps and gets blood on her hands, and then she goes crazy and commits suicide. And, like, I kind of read this as similar. Like, Smerdyakov, like, yeah, he says that Yvonne told him to do it and that Yvonne understood all those signals, but I kind of feel like it was Smerdyakov who kind of took the lead on this and then tried to convince Yvonne that Yvonne was actually a part of it. And so, yeah, maybe, like, the actual murder drove him crazy, but not the ideas, not the conversations with Yvonne. I don't think that's... I don't know.
What I was trying to say is that living by these ideas drove him insane. The actual carrying out of the murder didn't work out as well as he had hoped.
Gotcha. Then we are in agreement.
he wasn't able to live with the idea after the fact, you know. Everything didn't feel so permitted after you've got blood on your hands, I guess, you know. By the way, Jenny, I just have to point out we can tell how deeply ingrained in theater you've been because you refuse to say Macbeth out loud.
Even for the characters.
I do, even when I'm not in a theater. I can never say it.
Better safe than sorry.
Right. I've actually been witness to part of the curse. We had somebody break their leg during a rehearsal.
Wow.
We had all of the money stolen from our theater club in high school. The night that everybody decided to, like, break the curse by standing in a circle and chanting Macbeth over and over again. This shit happens.
Wow.
I mean, confirmation bias, but still.
I don't know. That's in this court. This is gonna fly. You know.
I find it interesting that everyone that interacts with Ivan, it seems like, whether it's us, not Sniggy, Smerdyakov, or Eliza, or even Katerina in this chapter, like, kind of goes crazy.
He's got a Midas touch.
Yeah. Talking about, like, the curse of Macbeth. I mean, it's like the curse of Ivan is, like, seemingly apparent here to me. But
all right, I think we better move on.
Oh, can I flag one more small thing?
Yeah.
That I enjoy the. I think this we touched on it before, but this has the little joke. I assume that it is that when the prosecutor is going on about the press, he's like, we would never even find out about things like this if it weren't for, like, newspapers, which for a story that's being printed in the newspaper is pretty rich. That's how you find out about exactly things like this.
Well, and actually, that phrase too made me think of Yvonne's collection of horrors that he recited in the Rebellion chapter that were all things that Dostoevsky had actually collected from a newspaper.
Which I think was, I don't know, like, I was weirdly... Maybe it's just that newspapers were were coming into their modern form in the late 19th century, but I can think of a few examples of, like, people who had collections of, like, horrific things from newspapers and would, like, write about them. Like, William James writes about that, and a few other philosophers from, like, the late 19th century write about that. I think something about the sudden crush of news really broke people's brains at that point.
Yeah, although they had started in the 18th century in England. And I wonder if part of this was the beginning of a more or less free press in Russia, you know? Like, I kind of got that sense that maybe some liberties had been expanded in the recent past to the press, But anyway, I don't know the history of Russia that well. So we have a historical survey. And to be honest, I don't remember what this chapter is about at all. Oh, I guess this is just, I don't know, his retelling of the case. I don't know. Does anyone have anything to say about this chapter?
Yeah, I mean, he's trying to dive into the psychology. This is where he's like, so as a murderer, he didn't plan it at first. He just shouted about it. But then
right.
by the time it got to the weapon, he recognized it as a weapon right away. Like, he's retelling everything, but trying to, like, delve into Mitya's motivations and doing kind of a shitty job of it.
I don't know if I would feel that he was doing a bad job of it if I hadn't, been on Dimitri's side. Like, if I were in the jury here, I'd be like, this sounds incredibly plausible,
I mean, I feel like I always am ending up being the one being skeptical, but I know partly that's because I know Dimitri's innocent. But to me, this did feel weird where he's saying stuff like, when you nothing looks like a weapon until you decide it might be a weapon, and that's why he took the pestle. Like, some of these things feel like really strained attempts to put psychology into play, and it feels like fitting everything. Like, I do think he's doing what we said. He's weaving a coherent narrative out of all the details, which is what the jury will like. But to me, I'm like, what? It like feels like more examples of what we saw last time, where like 1 minute Dimitri was just yelling and he didn't have a plan, and the next minute it was premeditated, but the next minute it wasn't premeditated because he thought, like, I just can't keep track, like, of all the arguments. They don't seem to quite match up. Like, especially that one. Like, at some points the prosecutor seems to be saying, look, we have this letter he wrote, it was premeditated, and at other points he's like, no, it wasn't, and I don't know. I wasn't buying it.
So, hey, everybody.
Whoa!
Hey!
Hi.
So, well, I told Aaron I was too tired to do this, but after only being able to sleep an hour and then waking up feeling guilty about not coming to book club for being too tired, I couldn't get back to sleep, so here I am.
You're guilty for all, actually.
It's funny because I do feel the need to confess to something, but like I really don't have anything that's like both serious and not embarrassing, and I don't feel like confessing something minor that would be equally embarrassing. So anyway, so here I am. But I think that like the point just Melissa made about the narrative, like I think it's so interesting how like the prosecutor, like the whole thing is you have to tell a better story than the other side. Like that's been like in the history of like criminal law, like people in rhetoric have been writing about that for thousands of years, about how evidence can go one way or the other, but ultimately it's usually about who tells the better story, who wins, who convinces the people. And I think what's really interesting in this case, like with the whole weapon, it doesn't look like a weapon until you kind of decide you're going to use it as one. It's interesting that when it comes to jurors, people need to see things in narratives. And when I was in grad school, I had this professor who had us do research on that Netflix documentary, The Making of a Murderer. And then, in addition, had us, like, read the actual, like, case notes and what was presented to the jury about this guy who the documentary says was, wrongfully convicted of murder and set up by the state and everything else. And then you actually, like, read the state's case like we had to for our class, and we're like, oh my gosh, this guy was completely guilty and rightfully convicted. And like the reason why I bring it up is because the weird thing is, and prosecutors, like, I think they have to come up with this stuff because like criminals, even though when they're committing crimes, they're not necessarily all that intelligent. Like oftentimes criminals do things that seem so stupid, like murdering someone with like this completely random thing. Yet, like an experienced prosecutor will say, a lot of evidence, when you have a lot of evidence against people, a lot of it doesn't make sense. because people, when they're committing crimes, frequently are just not behaving particularly intelligently or rationally. And yet, unless you, because the thing is, and what was so interesting when we had to watch this documentary is the way the documentary tried to sell us this guy was innocent, was that why would a guy be stupid enough to like do this and do this and do this and leave this smorgasbord of evidence? No, it must have been planted. When it all kind of goes away under the small assumption of maybe the guy's just not too bright. Maybe when the guy committed the crime, maybe he just was kind of like a little haphazard about it. And maybe things don't seem to make sense because the guy is committing a crime. And when you're committing a crime, you're not necessarily whatever. And so as I was reading this part, I actually thought the prosecutor was doing a really, really good job of taking something that just seems so ridiculous, but presenting it in such a way where it can seem just plausible enough where, like, even though the circumstances seem ridiculous, just by creating that narrative and just by getting people to imagine that circumstance, right? Now the defense has a narrative they have to undo, and that's the first narrative in their mind. And like, that's the thing. Like, I think it's so amazing how, because I believe that it wasn't Dmitry. I believe it was Smerdyakov. But like, all they have to do, right, is make people believe that story just for a little bit. And like, the fact that like people tend to believe that innocent people don't generally get put on trial for murder, like, it just seems so compelling. And like, I don't know, as I was listening to it, I'm thinking, if I'm a Russian juror, and who knows what the average education of a Russian juror is, like, even though I'm on Dmitry's side, as I'm listening to this, I actually kind of got a sickening feeling, because I was thinking, you know, I can see them totally buying this. Like, I mean, I don't know if I personally would have bought it if I had had that level of education back then, but as I was reading it, like, I just felt like, yep, they're gonna buy this. That was just, I don't know, because it's the first story they're gonna hear, and it doesn't have to make perfect sense. It just has to make sense enough.
Well, I think he has an incredibly strong case. I mean, I think I disagree with people who are saying he's doing a muck-up job. Like, I think he's doing a fantastic job.
Did I say he was doing a muck-up job?
No.
I don't know. Okay.
There's too much psychology in it, yeah. And even the crowd makes fun of him for that. But
well, and I think I was the one who said he was doing a shitty job, and I think I said that because it makes me mad, because I know Dmitry's innocent. Not that, I mean, he's the prosecutor. It is his job to present this case, and he's doing a fine job of it. I'm just mad about it.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think like in my long thing, and because I'm so tired, I think I like cited all my evidence, but didn't present my conclusion. The point is even though the evidence itself is compelling enough, I think the whole point is with jurors, they just don't care about how much evidence you have. He needed all that psychology because people tend to find the story is more important than the evidence, even when the evidence is overwhelming. Therefore, I think he was overdoing the psychology simply because he was aware that the story is ultimately what matters to the average juror.
well, I think let's move on. I actually I want to point out what I thought was his best moment. Bottom of 705. He's got the pestle in his hand. He's in the garden, like he's worked up in a state, you know, about is my girl here, you know, with my dad or not? So the unfortunate man steals up to the window, respectfully peeks in, virtuously resigns himself, and sensibly departs, hasting to put trouble behind him, lest something dangerous and immoral happen. Like, it does sound completely unreasonable to believe that, and he's just sort of mocking that that's the only story we have to contradict all the evidence. It's like, I had a good feeling and I decided to run away, you know? So let's move on to Treatise on Smerdikov. This probably is the most painful chapter to read, I thought, because it is a complete mischaracterization of Smerdikov after we've heard his own confession. And it's just really hard to watch him walk us point by point through why it's impossible for it to be Smerdikov. And yeah, particularly with like the evidence of the envelope and how this is how a sloppy and careless, thief would act. It's like, but Smerdikov planted it, man, exactly, and even gave you guys that idea. Like Smerdikov actually led them to that idea, if you remember, trying to make it seem like they came up with it. So I don't know if there's a lot we need to talk about in this chapter. You guys tell me, but it's just infuriating to read.
I mean, pretty much the same thing as with the last chapter. He's using all this psychology and painting this one picture that, like, we as the audience, as readers, know is inaccurate. Because, like, we have a confession from Smerdykov's lips that completely contradicts all of this, and yet the prosecutor's painting this as if it can be the only story. Or, I guess, pretty much the prosecutor's painting two stories that he thinks are completely ludicrous. And saying, since we can't believe either of these two stories, it can't have been Smerdikov.
Now, here's an interesting question, because he brings
I think
up,
a lot of us are reviewing this. Oh, crap. Sorry about that.
I was just going to say, an interesting point that he brings up is that about Smerdykov's suicide note, that it would have cost him nothing to add, I am the murderer, not Karamazov, but he didn't do it. Did he have enough conscience for the one thing but not the other? And I do wonder about that a little bit. Like, what is going on with Smerdikov that he kills himself? Obviously, he doesn't care about Dmitri. I guess hang him. Like, he's been tormenting me the whole time. But that's I don't know. Anyone want to comment on why Smerdikov left the particular note he did? And still left Dmitri on the hook?
Well, I don't know that someone always necessarily... I don't know that people die from suicide because they just have a moral... You know what I mean? It's not necessarily like I'm punishing myself. It could just be despair. It could just be... I mean, I think that's too neat and tidy.
I don't think he kills himself from remorse.
Exactly, yeah. I don't think he does it out of remorse.
I think he's just punching his ticket according to the Ivan way.
The several times, or each time it got brought up, I kept thinking that the author is saying that one is responsible for their ideas. That Dostoevsky is somebody who's participating in a long history of tradition, and he's talking about European Enlightenment and these ideas. So I could be reading entirely into something that's not there, but I felt like he keeps slapping the notion that if you create an idea, you're responsible for it.
But what does that have to do with this? I'm not following the connection of...
Plot-wise, I don't care. I don't think it has anything to do with anything.
I'm trying to... Are you making a comment about the suicide note in Smerdikov? Because I'm not following.
Yeah, over and over and over again, Ivan's ideas to him perpetuated this. Here's this dullard who doesn't fully understand these ideas from someone who's less dull, who doesn't fully comprehend these ideas. At some point, there's an accountability and a responsibility for touting any idea.
Yeah. Here's this just like kind of coalesced here. I think, like I was saying, it's just like he's punched his ticket according to Ivan's theology. So he's almost like showing Ivan like how much he actually understands Ivan, and Ivan's ideas by killing himself. Like he's kind of come full circle, and he understands even better than Ivan does.
Right? Isn't it nice to talk to an intelligent person?
Yes.
Are you saying he's returned his ticket?
Yes.
That's Ivan's thing about I don't accept the world.
Right. And that's what I think that's what Smerdikov's doing here when he's killing himself. He's returning his ticket according to Ivan's thing. So like everything's permitted. He's gone along this. This isn't a suicide by remorse. This is him acting out according to despair of everything and punching his ticket.
Why does he come to that though? Why doesn't he just cynically run off to France like his dream was?
Everything's permitted, but everything's meaningless. I mean, I think it's more of a despair versus remorse. Like,
Right. I do think morally committing the murder did something to him. He's going through some process of realizing everything's not committed. Or, God, I'm getting so tired. He's realizing that not everything really is permissible. Some things have consequences, and part of it, like his health is disintegrating, right? Like, I get the sense that he's not going to make it to France, even if he tries to run off to France. Like, this guy is not in good shape. So it does seem like, but I just don't think he doesn't write a letter saying, I'm so guilty, I can't bear this anymore, right? He's just like, I don't want to blame anybody, so I'm out of here. So like, Taggy, I find your reading really compelling that he's like, well, everything was permissible. I tried it. Like, time to dash the cup, right? Like, what's left? I'm dying this painful, miserable death.
It seems strange to me, though, that he says, I do this so as not to blame anybody, but meanwhile, he's blaming Dmitri for his murder. You know, like, it's weird to me that he makes sure they know his suicide was by his own hand. I don't know.
I think this guy's like just messing with everybody. Like, to be honest, like he wants to be accepted by Ivan. Like, you can really tell that. Like, he's always had this like complex where he can't find any sort of meaning in any of his interactions with anybody else. Like, he wants to be this stupendously ideological, intellectual person. He finds his equal with Ivan. He merges onto Ivan's ideas, and here's me being a prosecutor, like weaving together all this crap. But here he understands Ivan. He wants to talk to Ivan before he kills himself, so that Ivan knows that he like found out his total view, psychology, and everything else. Like, he put it all together, and so now he's going to go dash the cup. Like, Ivan's his, like, he's the protege of Ivan, and now he will be fully accepted by his suicide, more or less. It's kind of like this weird paradoxical strange thing that's going on, I think, in Smerdyakov.
And in this way, Ivan ends up responsible and suffers from a similar affliction to his unintended protege.
Yes.
I always thought that the suicide had a lot to do with the fact that, I mean, I don't know. I mean, yes, it's because everything is permissible, but I feel like, you know, like morality exists on two levels. On one hand, it exists on the level of principles, and then more basically exists on the level of relationships. Like, you know, like there's a difference between someone who'll steal from their family versus someone who will, you know, shoplift from Walmart. Most people won't steal from their family, but a lot of people will be like, well, fuck Walmart, right? Just because of the relationship is different. And I feel like Ivan and his, you know, the fact that Ivan could not approve, I wonder, you know, did Smerdyakov expect that he would finally gain Ivan's respect or finally gain Ivan's approval that he already wanted? Like, I don't know. I've always felt like the suicide was always directed specifically at Ivan.
Ginny, I think you were. I'm sorry, Micah.
Oh, go ahead.
I think Ginny was trying to say something like 2 or 3 minutes ago, and I just wanted to see if.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I was just waiting for everybody else to finish. Micah, did you have more to that thought?
Well, I just, I just always felt like it. I always felt like it was a. Even though he's condemning Dmitri by not claiming responsibility for the murder, I always thought it was aggressive towards Ivan. I always thought it was a way to torture Ivan in a way. Because now, like with him dead, there's no way, right, that they can ever, question him. There's no way they can ever try to like show in court Dmitri, is not guilty. And now, I don't know. I'm surprised that like I don't know. I just always felt very strongly that this was all about, a big middle finger to Ivan, even though he's also disintegrating. I feel like he partly blames Ivan for that disintegration.
I think it's really interesting, actually. I'm kind of glad I got interrupted because I like hearing everybody else's theories because mine isn't like really strong. I think this is what it is, but just as an possible alternate reading, I don't feel real strongly about, but it also occurs to me that, there's a possible reading that Smirjakov is just, I don't know, kind of a dick. And that he's committing suicide to avoid having to deal with the consequences of the murder he committed. So, whatever level of guilt that he is feeling about this murder, and especially, now that he's confessed to Ivan and, the trial's about to start tomorrow, like, this is the time at which he would have to face consequences. And like, I think there's a reading where he just doesn't want to face those consequences. So like he pieces out. And McG, when you read the, I don't know what page it's on, so I'm not going to get the quote exactly right, but could he have enough conscience to say his suicide was nobody's fault, but not enough conscience to admit to Fyodor's murder? Is that possible? I literally yelled at the book when I was reading it. I was like, yes, of course that's possible. Like, those are two completely different things. Like, it's one thing to be like, okay, this is a suicide, let's not make a court case out of this, like this, let's clear this, but still want to avoid the consequences of Fyodor's murder. Like, I think those are, they're related, obviously, but I think in terms of the suicide note, those are two different things, and it's completely possible to admit to one and not the other.
Thank you, everybody, for sharing different perspectives and thoughts on that. That's, I think, a question that we needed to ask, and it happened so late in the last book that we never really covered it, because it was already late at night. So we're after midnight here. I want to start to wrap things up. So let's talk about the last chapter here, the finale of the prosecutor's speech, Psychology at Full Steam, the Galloping Troika. By the way, if you don't know what a troika is, it's a kind of special carriage pulled by 3 horses that's designed to go really fast, and the horses use a particular, trained gait in order to do it. And it's a very Russian thing.
They probably drink vodka too for their fuel.
Are you talking about the horses?
Yes.
So I guess a lot of this is more of just Kirillovich's psychological retelling of Dmitri's motivations, and maybe those aren't even worth going through particularly. But
epic flex by Dostoevsky to be like, this is the Russian Hamlet. Check it out.
Yeah, I don't think there's much to say about this that we haven't already said about just the way the prosecution is characterizing the psychology and the narrative versus what already happened. I mean, I feel like we've gone into that so much tonight. I just want to jump to the very end. I mean,
yeah, I think it's really the ending of the speech that maybe bears some comment.
I was actually thinking about all the different conversations that like our narrator overheard in the break between the prosecutors and defendants' speeches. I thought it was interesting.
Just trash.
It actually reminds me of like when the Muppets cut to the old guys, you know?
Statler and Waldorf.
Yeah.
The talking heads.
I thought the interesting part of the speech here is his troika image for Russia, sort of out of control, troika that's heading no one knows where, but really, really fast, and everyone is getting out of the way for it. And there's the interesting question of, is that out of respect or out of fear? And he's kind of saying, look how backwoods they already think we are as a bunch of frickin' European rednecks. Like, what are they going to say if we clear a guy who killed his father? Like, the other nations might have to intervene or whatever. So that seems to be his whole. Again, I'm a little bit surprised that he's allowed to do this in court, but to basically say, convict this guy to save Russia, our nation depends on it,
Yeah.
Evidently they don't.
Great again.
Yeah, right. They don't seem to have objections at this point in the in the court system.
Bernards, but it's not quite the same thing.
Yeah. You guys want to talk about those conversations afterwards at all?
Is the one with the lorgnette, the fat one at the end, is that Grushenka?
What?
No. On the last page, they're scoping the ladies.
Yeah, it can't be because it says former wife of a general, a divorcee.
Oh, okay, right, because she didn't ever marry her pan.
Right.
Okay.
He was a colonel, I think.
Well, he turned out to be like a very minor official. All right, I get the sense that everyone's ready for bed. So let's call it a night for tonight. For next week, we will finish the book 12, but not the epilogue. So finish the rest of this book. It's basically the defense attorney's speech.
Woo.
And we'll see you then. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.